Ah, should I say all that again? What was I saying? Okay. I'm a professor of international development at Imperial College, and I'm technically challenged, particularly at Imperial College. I want to welcome you to this launch of the latest Montpellier panel report. The panel consists of 16 European and African experts in agriculture. We are funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and our role is to try and work with European donors, both public and private, and that includes the Rome agencies, to do a better job of supporting agriculture in Africa. A job that's maybe more integrated, more aligned, and so on and so forth. And so that's what we set out to do. And our latest report is on soils, and that's what we're going to present. I'd like to welcome, I notice there's a large number of ambassadors and permanent representatives. I can't go through all the list. I'd particularly like to welcome Marcela Villarreal, who is here as the representative of the Director General of FAO, and thank you for coming in that role. But I'm doing the welcoming, but actually the person who's really going to do the welcome is Kanaya Nwanzi. We've known each other for a long time, way back in the days when Kanaya was Director General of what was then called WARDA, the now Africa Rice. He oversaw the research that led to the creation of the NERICAs, the New Rices for Africa, which when I was at Rockefeller we partly funded. And I'm very pleased to see how well that is now doing, particularly, for example, in Nigeria. There's a big uptake of the NERICAs, and I think we can be proud of that. The other common feature we have is that both of us trained as entomologists. And I want you to know that it's the entomologists, like the insects, who will eventually rule the world. Can I ask you to say a few words, please?
Thank you very much, Sir Gordon Conway. Colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to have been asked to host, for IFAD to host this event here. So let me thank Sir Professor Gordon Conway for his insightfulness in asking that we host this event here. I am pretty sure that he will continue to enlighten us when we hear his thoughts on the issues related to food production and hunger, and how the health of the soil in which plants grow, in which animals feed, are of particular importance in our efforts to reduce poverty and hunger in the world. IFAD welcomes the publication of the Montpellier panel report, which highlights the critical importance of soil management to food security. People who live in cities think of soil as dirt. But those of us who work in agriculture, whether it's livestock, food crops, cash crops, poultry, fisheries for that matter, I know that healthy soils as a foundation for a healthy food system and healthy lives. Now, when soils are depleted, the food we eat become depleted also of minerals and the other nutrients that the plants are supposed to receive from a healthy soil. Unfortunately, this very precious resource has been wasted. About 1/4 of our planet's land is highly degraded or already showing signs of degradation. In contrast, only 10% of land is stable or shows no sign of degradation, only 10%. And so the cost of degradation is huge. Now, to put a dollar amount on the loss, it's estimated in a recent UN CCD report that degradation costs $10 billion a year for China alone. But of course, the costs are more than economic. Land degradation is a threat to biodiversity. It can lead to prolonged episodes of famine in poor countries that cannot sustain large agricultural losses. And the women and the men who depend on the land for survival to often go hungry, or they are forced to migrate. And we, all of us here in Europe, are beginning to experience the impact of that migration. Land degradation is often a cause as well as a consequence of rural poverty. People who live in dry lands lag far behind the rest of the world in human well-being, and they suffer from the worst economic conditions, and they have the highest infant mortality rates. At IFAD, we are confronted every day by the human cost of soil degradation. Essentially, because we work with small farmers, with subsistence farmers, nomadic herders, day laborers, and others whose survival depends upon very fragile lands. And the people we work with, rural populations, are oftentimes marginalized in many ways, not only economically, not only financially, but also in terms of the health of the land, the farm, or they live in. They are often thrown to the edges, to the margins of land that is supposed to be healthy, oftentimes deprived of access to basic requirements for a healthy soil. In our 35 years or more, it has become very clear to us that in order to eliminate rural poverty and hunger, we must also address the issue of how land and natural resources are managed. I do not, at this forum, need to explain why IFAD devotes its resources, 100% of our resources, in working with rural populations. If we actually want to achieve zero hunger, if we actually want to eliminate poverty and hunger, and malnutrition, we have to go to where it exists, or where they exist. Of course, there's poverty in urban areas, in peri-urban areas, but they make up between 15 and 20% of the world's poor. 70 to 80% of the world's poor live in rural areas, in marginal areas. If we want to solve the world's problem of hunger and poverty, land degradation, that is where we should focus our efforts. And that is what IFAD does. Our work addresses many causes of land degradation, deforestation, overgrazing, intensive farming, and of course the encroachment of agriculture into unsuitable areas. And this is often what happens when people are marginalized. We also help poor people in rural areas to adapt and be more resilient to other factors, such as the rising temperatures caused by climate change. Thanks to our members, IFAD has the largest operational program that addresses farmers' adaptation, smallholder adaptation to climate change, what we call ASAP, that is globally operational today. We also work to ensure secure land rights for poor rural people, because without the security of tenure of ownership, farmers cannot risk making long-term investments in the land and are forced to resort to short-term approaches that too often diminish soils, such as overgrazing and continuous cropping. when we speak about soils, oftentimes we are limited to the biological and the physiological aspects of soils, and forgetting that there are very strong sociological components that also impact on the way soils and land is used, land rights. All well and good to address the biophysical and biological degradation of soils, but we should do so in the context of the social implications, human behavior, policies, and how they impact on the use and tenure of land. So at IFAD, we are glad to see that the panel report has made secure land rights a priority, including it as one of its 10 recommendations. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we know that a combination of approaches is needed to improve and sustain the world's soils. It is possible to conserve, it is possible to restore, it is even possible to enhance Africa's and the world's soils. But to do this, it requires an understanding of agroecological approaches and a commitment to investment in integrated soil management systems. We at IFAD welcome the panel's report's focus on integrated soil management and its inclusion in the 10 recommendations. In recognition of the fact that soils constitute the foundation of agricultural development and ultimately food security, the United Nations General Assembly designated tomorrow to the World Soils Day, with events marking the occasion at the FAO, and declared 2015 as the International Year of Soils. Please join me in thanking the Montpellier Panel Agriculture for Impact, Sir Gordon Conway for his contribution to efforts in strengthening Africa's agricultural and economic potential. And once again, thank you for accepting to have this event at IFAD. And we welcome you very much and hope you have productive and successful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanaya. I think we decided to write this report about 7 or 8 months ago, and we knew that there was going to be an International Year of Soils, and then we worked out where we were going to launch it, and we thought the ideal place is IFAD, because, of course, IFAD is concerned with the lives of smallholder farmers, particularly in Africa, and because we knew that if we could get the Director General to come and speak here, the President could come and speak here, we would have an introduction that in some senses took the words out of our mouths. And I have to say that somehow I wish we'd been able to get your speech at the beginning of the report. If we do a second edition, that's what we'll have to do. Thank you very much indeed for that and for the inspiring comments. I have 3 members of the panel here. I said there were 15. I have 3. On my far right is David Radcliffe. David is the senior advisor in AgDevco, not in AgDevco, in the EU's DevCo, working to Jean-Pierre Halkin, who is the head of agriculture. He's been there for a number of years. Before that, he was working in DFID. And I'm going to get him in a moment to talk about land degradation. He is by profession a soil scientist, and he's done a lot to help us write the report. On my left is Camilla Tumin, who many of you will also know. Camilla is the director of the International Institute for Environment and Development. She and I go back a long way. We actually used to have offices next door to each other, something like 20 years ago or more. More than, I'm afraid so. But we hatched all kinds of things together. I became a great admirer of her and her work and her adventures in Western Africa. I twisted her arm to come here because she's meant to be in Peru for the conference on climate change. And I said, but you can fly via Rome. And so that's what she's doing. She's just arrived from London, and she's going to walk out straight away from here and get the plane to Lima. So as she says, I now owe her a lot. At least a good lunch and a bottle of wine. Okay, there we are. I've just made that promise. It's gone out live. And on my far left is Henri Caslade, who many of you will know. He was in FAO for many years. He and I go back again quite a long way. And talking about a bottle of wine, Henri is by far the world's best expert on choosing good wine. And that was always an incentive for me to come to Rome, because he would say, I found somewhere new and special. And Henri is now the chair of the Agropolis Fondation Agropolis in Montpellier, and he is also on the board of Africa Rice. But by the way, I should have said that Camilla is chair of IFAD. I think I've introduced everybody along the way. They come with many hats. I'm going to start with David and get David to say a few words about soils and land degradation, which in the report you'll find 2 or 3 pages there. And I think our findings have been really quite surprising. We hadn't realized the extent of land degradation. It's now very well documented, the extent of land degradation in Africa. So, David, would you say a few words now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gordon. And there's a very close linkage, of course, between soil and wine. But apart from that, I was personally very pleased that the panel had chosen to focus on soils as a topic for one of our papers, because I think soils have been neglected. And of course, soils are absolutely essential to agriculture, it goes without saying, but not only agriculture. You know, soils perform a lot of important regulating services and ecosystem services as well. Cycling nutrients, storing water, and soils, of course, exist in a landscape, so that what happens to a soil near the top of a hill might affect what happens to the farmers at the bottom of the hill as well. So we have to really think of soils in that sort of landscape context in order to understand their properties and also their tendency to erode and degrade as well. I'd like to emphasize really that soils are very different in their properties, and there is a soil map in the report. Well, that is obviously a big approximation of the variability of soils in Africa. But I think all but one of the major FAO soil types are represented in Africa. So we have a huge diversity of soils, and they can vary, of course, in very short distances. I mean, if you're driving through much of Africa, you can immediately realize when you come onto another soil type, because you have a difference in agricultural practice. You know, you can come off of the grazing area onto an intensively farmed area, and that is often related to the difference in soil type. And of course, African capacity to map these soil types is quite a critical issue as well, and we're aware of the depletion in capacity over the last 20 or 30 years or so. But coming on to that, of course, the difference in soil properties affects their tendency to degrade. This is related to structure. It's related particularly to use. I mean, erosion of soils is actually a natural process, but it's tempered very much by how soils are used. So if you have intensive land use without conservation of some sort, your soils can disappear very rapidly. And looking across Africa, and I think Camilla will probably talk about this in more detail, there are a lot of different ways of managing soils in such a way that their tendency to degrade is limited. But just to give us sort of an overview, you know, we're talking about billions of dollars. I think Kanayo mentioned $10 billion for China. Well, in fact, the figure quoted for Africa is $68 billion a year lost due to land degradation. You know, which sort of throws up the question how we actually value soils. You know, do we put a true economic value on them, and do we have a basis for creating incentives for people to manage them better? And of course, the people who are at the receiving end of this degradation are nearly always the poor. You know, the poor smallholder farmers, the graziers, whose livelihoods depend substantially on agriculture, and who often have to cope with the poorest soils, or with soils that are physically degrading. And certainly if you go to places like Wollo or Tigray in Ethiopia, you see the sort of pressures that land is under through degradation. So I think I will stop there, and obviously there will be opportunities to intervene later. Thank you.
David, one of the figures in there is about the level of degradation in Africa. We worked quite closely with Joachim von Braun's institute in the University of Bonn, which I think is probably doing the best work on measuring land degradation now. I mean, they're measuring with a lot of qualifications the changes in biomass over time using satellite imagery. And their figure comes up with 25% of the land of sub-Saharan Africa being severely degraded. In other words, the hotspots of degradation, 25%. That's an enormous figure when you think about it, 25%. And so we need to keep that figure in our minds, that we've got a massive problem there. When I say we, it's not just African farmers or African governments. It's all of us, because we have a strong and intimate relationship, those of us outside Africa, with Africa, and we're bound, of course, by the increasing pressures on our lives to produce more food. I'm going to turn now to Camilla, and Camilla is going to talk about a number of things, but in particular about the notion of integrated soil management as a way of going forward. Camilla.
Great. Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Gordon. As a member of the panel, I was really pleased when we got agreement that we'd do a report on soil, partly because of the timing with the International Year of Soils coming up next year, but also because, although I'm not an entomologist, I'm only a dismal economist, my first real job was working on soils when I was working in central Mali with farmers and livestock keepers, and learning about how farmers and livestock keepers work out all sorts of complicated deals whereby livestock keepers get access to water and grazing, and farmers, of course, trade that water and grazing for access to dung. And dung is an absolutely critical part of maintaining soil fertility in many of these systems. So it's lovely to see some of the photos coming through on those West African Sahelian farming systems, the Faidherbia albida, with the millet and sorghum below. I want to mention 4 particular things. Clearly, soil is right at the heart of healthy food systems. We've got colleagues in London at the moment holding a big meeting looking at urbanization and the enormous growth in demand that comes from both the growth in population but also the growth in incomes in many of Africa's urban centres. And essentially that demand can be met either from imports or from local production. At the moment, a lot of that demand is being met from imports, but it doesn't need to be that way. There's a whole series of policy and investment measures that could considerably improve both the productivity of the farming system, the jobs that go with that, the processing, the value chains that would allow Africa's farmers to benefit much more from that growth in urban populations. And I think having a healthy soil is right at the root, if you'd like, of that. The second thing, Gordon mentioned I'm on my way to Lima, like tens of thousands of other people, because Lima is this critical stepping stone to the Paris Conference of the Parties this time next year, when we desperately want and need a firm signal from all governments around the world on addressing climate change in a much more systematic and committed way. Of course, soil management, integrated soil management, is particularly important within a context of changing climate, partly because, as we've seen, as warming happens globally, you get a lot more rainfall and you get extraordinary downpours, torrents of rain, a month's rain fall in a single night. And that has potentially devastating impacts on soils. It causes massive erosion. So that within the context of climate change, particularly that change in patterns of rainfall, looking after your soil, protecting it, building the structures, keeping ground cover on the soil is of ever greater importance. Soils could also be a major part of the solution to climate change through the sequestration of carbon. Huge capacity to do that if we can get the management systems and the incentive systems right. My third point relates to tenure, and I was just delighted that IFAD's president spoke those wise words about the importance of land tenure, because at IID we've been banging on about that for a long time. If you're going to invest long-term in land, you need security that you'll benefit from those long-term investments. So clarifying, recognizing and supporting local farmers' rights to land is key if you want to get them to invest in making the soil more productive. And there's a whole variety of traditional methods for managing that soil fertility in an integrated way. I've mentioned livestock and the important role of livestock dung, but there's also a whole variety of other things that people are doing, such as planting leguminous crops, beans and peas, and those trees such as Faidherbia albida. That's a key traditional technique. But there are also other ways in which farmers try to build up soil through composting, and also try to protect their soils through terracing, through windbreaks, and so on. But they're not going to do that if they feel that they're not going to benefit from that investment, and so tenure is key. My last point relates to price, and particularly the price and availability of fertilizer. Because if you look at fertilizer use levels in most African farming systems, it's minuscule. It's averaging 7, 8, 9 kilos per hectare, as compared with 130, 150 on average across the world, and more than 400 in many farming systems in China. So you're looking at very low levels of chemical fertilizer use, which, if you combine with better use of organic matter, can have really spectacular results. So we're really calling for governments to give soil far more attention, to think through pricing and availability of fertilizer, issues around tenure, and ways to try and get a better balance between urban and rural growth.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm just going to say a few more words about climate and soils. We've got a section in there called Climate Smart Soil. I think we're the first people to actually coin that phrase. We all know that the climate, well, I hope everybody in this room knows that the climate is changing, and changing dramatically. It's going to be the hottest year for many years for the globe. It's going to be the hottest year for Britain since 1600. And we know it. I've got daffodils in the garden already. Spring has come, and the frogs are breeding already in Britain. I mean, these are the extremes that you can see in your own gardens here in Europe. You go to Africa, you see it. You go to northern Ghana, I was there recently, and the rains came a month late, and they finished a month early, so they only had 100 days to grow a crop. And it's quite tough finding the right kind of rice variety that'll give you a yield within 100 days. We know that soils are important. You can do adaptive things with soils. You can get soil temperature to go down above 30 degrees. The temperature really starts to cause a lot of harm in the soil. You can get it to go down by 4 to 6 degrees by mulching. We know that soil moisture is going to get less, and we can do a great deal to improve soil moisture through gully plugs and terraces and so on and so forth, and we've described all of those. And then we can do a great deal to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Because as we know, it's not just carbon dioxide that we're talking about nitrous oxide and methane, and nitrous oxide is 300 times as powerful as carbon dioxide, and methane is over 30 times as powerful. The nitrous oxide, of course, comes from nitrogen. There are all kinds of schemes available to make that reduction. And we also know, as Camilla has said, that we can sequester carbon in the soil. It's quite a complicated process. We've had a lot of advice from Ratan Lal, the great soil scientist at Ohio State. And he makes the point that if you're going to get soil organic carbon, which is the key, into the humus, you need nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur for that to happen. You need more nitrogen than is needed for the crops to get the soil organic carbon into the soil. It doesn't matter how much residue you put on the soil surface. It doesn't matter how much you cut down your maize and leave it on the surface. It won't get to become a soil organic carbon unless you have got some nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur to make it happen. You might get the nitrogen from livestock manure. You might get it from legumes. But in many parts of Africa, you're not going to get it unless you apply it. That's a key point here. Simply putting residue on the surface of the soil, which conservation farming, that if it's not practiced properly, does, won't be the answer. It's got to be integrated. And that's the key point that we're trying to make here. And all of this is going to cost money and time, and in particular, policy change. And so that's why I want to turn, finally, the last few comments from us before we open it to questions and comments all around, from Henri, who's going to talk about why and how soil is being ignored at the moment.
Many thanks, Gordon. Yes, we already said that soils in Africa are already damaged. Maybe more than you say, 20% badly damaged, 60% begin to be damaged, and this is very important. The fact is that it's not absolutely new. As young agronomists, some 45 or 50 years ago in Africa, we could already observe their degradation, and we had to begin to think at that time, it was the first time, in terms of sustainable management of resources. In short, at that time, the sub-Saharan country agriculture by colonial powers were considering soil like an expandable resources, like a mining process, you know. And if you visit oil palm plantation, cotton plantation, you will have the quick feeling and a strong feeling of what I say. At the same time, in the zones of highly populated small agriculture, the main issue was to feed the people, with little concern to the slow degradation of land and its reasons. That was maintained for many years. Cash crop on one side to have money for the countries and for the people, revenue, feed a growing population. And most of the policies have been productivist, I don't know if you say that in English, for many years. Production, production, production. And even after the need of being sustainable in our approaches were recognized everywhere, these continue to constitute the root of countries' policies and in some case of some donors' attitudes. So this is the ground of a situation. And this in part explains why land and soil management have been and still are absent of the top of the agendas of countries and international community. The report analyzes the CAADP national plans and stresses that the high majority of the plans do not prioritize land management. They should be, having been at FAO responsible of their preparation more than 10 years ago, I am not particularly proud of this. The report also stresses that donors continue to globally pay little attention to soil management as such, despite a wide recognition of the need of sound management of natural resources and human resources. There are some exceptions, like in France, like in US, like in Germany, like Bill Gates, like maybe IFAD has done many things, but it's clear to say that not enough money has been clearly devoted to integrated soil management in a clear way and an explicit one. This has to move, because I will not repeat what said my colleagues, and we are strongly convinced that this is a key to move this situation, the key for the future, and the key to face the big challenge that we have. What to do? That's much more difficult. You can analyze, but what to do is a set of things that are difficult to put in place together, because isolated solution cannot work. First of all, we need more money. We have to invest. We have to invest in land management, both countries and donor community. The report stresses that only 2% of the ODA is devoted to agriculture. Countries have to amend their CAADP plans to include a clear commitment for improving soil quality and combating degradation. If I remember, 3 or 4 of them only put that as a high priority. The rest, even some of them, don't speak at all of this aspect of sustainability. And donors also have to clearly mark the contribution that have to be dedicated towards combating land degradation in Africa. First, money investment. Second, I will not repeat because 2 of my colleagues said and President Wanze said that the insecure land tenure systems widely spread in Africa are key to problems facing integrated soil management. Those systems are poorly defined and disadvantage women. We have to have that also in mind, and all know the role of women in African agriculture. The tenure system clearly disadvantage women. And they have a multiple bad effects. You cannot sell the land, you cannot create, and the main one is investment is becoming difficult because you will not be able to wait for long-term fruits of an investment. This failure is maybe not only a consequence on land tenure, but also of access to finance and market, but remains at the middle of the picture. So the countries have to reform and clarify their land tenure system. Easy to say. They have to do it, and also to ensure that the new regulation put into practice, will be put into practice, because in many cases, I have seen when I was in FAO, countries developing new system of land tenure, and it was not working because it was not applied. So it was exactly the same situation than before. There is also a need of public intervention, clearly, to ensure that a better land tenure system is put in place. Will need public investment. It should be a bit long to explain, but you will find elements of it in the report. So, second point, ensure more secure land tenure system, and this is a key one. I am the third to repeat that. I am totally convinced of it. The third point is integrated soil management is in almost all African countries an issue cutting across departmental and ministerial lines. This is about agriculture, this is about forestry, this is about irrigation, this is about water, this is about finance, this is about customary or indigenous affairs, and so on, and so on. It's a difficult issue because it touches the responsibility of countries there and sensitivity. There is a high sensitivity on it, but it's a fact that integrated soil management issues do not fit with the usual institutional organization of the countries. And it needs holistic approaches, including in its institutional dimension. This is a very important point. Solutions may be task force, interministerial. We can discuss that. There is plenty. We have also examples. Should be long to develop the examples and to try to raise conclusions from the several we have. We have some experience also in FAO. But institutional arrangements are key to improve the solution. So this set of action taken both by the countries and the international community should be taken and maybe should be able to start a new movement in bettering the soil management. We need strong political leadership and commitment. We need dedicated policies and regulation, new institutional arrangement, and investment. And of course, countries have to put integrated soil management at the top of their agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. We are going to throw this open now for comments and discussion. We've got about half an hour. I would welcome any comments on the report as you've seen it or on what we've said. The recommendations are on page 3 and 4, and we've alluded to some of those. The key points that have come out right towards the end are about funding, they're about policies, they're about capacity building, and they're in particular about institutions. How do we get things to change? Please. Perhaps you would just at least say your name and affiliation. Over there in the corner, on the side.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Philip Baumgartner. I'm here in IFAD in the Technical and Advisory Unit. For a year now, I'm the German APO here. And before that, I was working with Joachim at Bonn. And I have 3 questions. Thanks, first of all, to the very interesting points you made. The first question goes to the cost of inaction versus costs of actions, and what is the kind of cheapest solution to address the issue. You mentioned the extent and the cost of soils being lost, but what are relatively cheap measures to address that across Africa? A second question is, what is the role of the private sector in addressing this? You mentioned the low application of fertilizer, but maybe there's other aspects. And the third question goes to the nexus of soil, land, and water. So soil leakage has costs for irrigation systems get polluted and everything, and healthy soils can maintain more water, but maybe you can elaborate also a bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and we thank IFAD and particularly the President for getting this document launched here at IFAD, and we appreciate the work of the panel, and particularly emphasizing the need of soil management in Africa. And I think in regard to the commitment, political commitment and institutional setup that the last speaker mentioned as requirements for soil management, I think there are some African countries that have already committed politically and also in terms of soil management. They are doing what needs to be done, this is including my own country, Ethiopia. The government is committed for an integrated soil management approach. Not only the government, but I think the people have been mobilized to restore, conserve, and enhance soil management for the last several years. And the members of the panel might have seen some of the results of that effort. In fact, about 2 years ago, the government started to identify the nutrient requirements of the soil, and soil mapping is taking place. There are 670 districts in the country, and already 310 of them have got their soils mapped. So within the next couple of years, all the countries will have their soils mapped. So the nutrients would be identified. In fact, already started. So efforts are being carried on. But to do that, as suggested by the panelists, resources are required. Capacity, institutional capacity build up is required, and financial resources are also required. So how do the panel think countries such as mine, which are really doing exactly what you are doing, be helped to do the work, to continue doing the work? Thank you.
Thank you. And you are the representative from Ethiopia, is that right? I guess so. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Mr. Bonfa. I am from Oxford Sustainable Development Enterprise, and my interest is more on innovation in agriculture. So my question, reading out the, let's say, suggestion from the panel, I see one aspect that could be of interesting, and I would like to more emphasize is, and this is the question of big data revolution. I mean, we know that in UK is moving toward this direction in agriculture. They're developing this big data, let's say, agriculture center, then is the basis for the innovation for the future agriculture. And this is, I think, a good approach. And I mean, my, let's say, my interest is going toward this direction of having the knowledge at basis. And what I do not see here is on integrated aspect, the strategy. I mean, if you don't have data, if you don't have analytical tools, if you don't have strategy, and where you know where you start, where you finish, I don't think agriculture will be not sustainable. Also integrate with other type of service. So this is my, let's say, interest in, and I just want to emphasize that Europe, with this multi-strategy specialization idea, that we are involved heavily on how the 2020 cohesion policy will be, let's say, for the next period. What we have at the basis is the smart strategy specialization. And at the base of this is the knowledge and therefore the data. This is also related with agriculture policy. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good point. Mark, please. I'll come to you at the end, and then we'll tackle those questions.